Okay, basically what I just said was that with LO, Learning Objective 1 was the methods and Learning Objective 2 is the theory. We can imagine Learning Objective 3 will be some sort of matching up of the two together and offering a much broader analysis, broader context, this sort of thing. If you remember, we touched on some theory yesterday. Human relations and scientific management theory. Are you clear about the scientific management theory? It's we mentioned McGregor, and the assumptions that the scientific management theory is pretty much like McGregor's theory X. Let me just get that up. Just a bit of background, really. Let's just get McGregor's theory X here. Theory X. Okay. Right. Let's just go into that now. See if we can get something really straightforward. Motivation. Well, something which is easy to read. Basically, the theory X was that it's still around today, you know. The theory X was like the scientific management school. Let's just putting it just vaguely. We mentioned that they thought people were lazy, lacking in ambition, didn't want to learn at all, stuck in the mud, resisting change, and there's no point developing them as individuals, no point looking at keeping them happy in the workplace, no point in keeping them motivated. It was just a matter of controlling them all the time, and maybe even punishing them. That was theory X. And Human Relations School, McGregor identified as adopting theory Y. And this is theory Y. And it just said that basically it's worth it spending some time and making sure that people are motivated properly, because you get better quality work out of them, and they even work harder. They don't dislike work. People are trustworthy. They do care and take ownership of their work, and they do want to develop themselves as human beings, not just out of the workplace, but in the workplace, you know, for their careers and things like this. That's theory Y. It's very easy to understand. There's no point in punishing them. That just doesn't work. The best way to do it is actually to motivate them, and the best way to do that is using making sure they've got some of their needs met. Maslow, remember last week, we didn't actually mention Maslow, but I showed you the picture. Here it is here. Make it a bit bigger. This is the Human Relations School. Let's get it bigger, not smaller. There it is. This guy Maslow, he did this, and he'd been around for a long time. Okay, so it's a bit vague, but at least he was the first to do it. He just said that, look, in the workplace, try and meet some of these things. Obviously, social psychology adopted all this, and especially developmental psychology. But it was also used in management circles, and obviously McGregor would support this in theory Y, you know, his belief that if you keep people happy by not giving them all of them, for heaven's sakes, like sexual, you know, there's some things that you couldn't do in the workplace, but some of them you can, like self-esteem, you know, like job titles. And also confidence would be like mentoring, helping them improve their confidence with the knowledge that they trained already hard, and they were already able and willing, and they got the capabilities, and all these sort of things that you can use to help motivate people in the workforce. Why? Because they work harder, and because they get better quality, take ownership, and they're more productive. Simple as that. So there's two. That's just a revision of some of the stuff we covered yesterday. Here's LO2. Understanding the management of people and how individual differences influence people's behaviour at work. Well, I mean, one thing there, individual differences, will be the manager's assumptions about people. And McGregor says quite a lot about it, as you know already. I looked through this earlier, obviously, and it's pretty much practice-based. And so it mentions case studies and empirical work. obviously it's concerning management of people. And so the one approach here, this is an approach. Another word for approach could be a way of looking at things, or even like a theory, an assumption, something that's implicit in the way you view things. Empirical approach is just viewing things, emptying the mind of assumptions if it's possible. But anyway, so what they thought here was that if we are going to look at managing people in organisations and understanding managing people and how individual differences can influence people's behaviour at work. Obviously, when they're looking at people's behaviour at work and influencing it, they're talking about influencing it so that they're more productive. That's really obviously a business context. So the empirical approach was the study of managerial experiences and cases. There's a lot of them. There's so much case study in management science, and it's been going on for a very, very, very long time. So we mentioned also case studies before, and case studies is just a really somebody's written up their experiences, their managerial experiences, and called it a case study, often in the academic world, and people use it to see if it's similar to their own experiences. Typically, it's written up, but sometimes it's verbal. It's passed on from practitioner to students. So I don't think there's a verbal tradition as such. It's really there's not really an oral tradition, isn't there? Not in management sciences. It's always written down, isn't it, and schematized and everything. And obviously, the empirical approach, they're identifying that as being the same as case studies. Okay. So they just study it, don't they, and they see what failed, and they combine their these experiences, and they kind of draw out some theory from it. It's empirical, don't forget. You might have come across that word before, inductive, empirical, in your earlier work. And they just build theory from there, so learning through experience of others. So it's quite straightforward, that one, empirical approach. I'm sure you've come across that before in other subjects. Now, this experiential approach is sometimes occupies. It doesn't get beyond the confines of the case study. Sometimes it's difficult to generalize even. Sometimes they don't even want to generalize. So it doesn't really fit in with earlier work, sometimes, the case studies. It depends on, we've mentioned that word before, like what kind of study is it? Is it qualitative or quantitative? But have you come across those two? Well, my guess is you've heard of those before, but if you haven't, just write it down and look it up in Wikipedia. So the limitation of that is whether the person who did the case study, whether they want to use that future development of the management as a discipline, or whether they just want it to be useful for themselves and only for themselves in their workplace context, and outside of helping anybody else in different contexts. Also, some people think that an assumption you make, obviously, is somebody made a mistake in the past, saying that given the same sets of circumstances, that they can not do the same thing in the present. This kind of assumption may not be correct. Okay, there may be other variables other than those identified in the situations of the past, and that haven't been looked at. So there's limitations to doing case study. That's all it is. Okay. Here we go. This is the human relations approach. You could call this empirical approach. It's part and parcel of the scientific management approach. It certainly has its roots in empirical research or empirical approach. That's what this is. But there's more to it. Sometimes they use deduction as well, but it's part of the we can put it in that camp, can't we? We can put it in the camp of scientific management. Why? Because the next one here is what? Human behaviour approach, human relations approach even. So there's the other one. But we've gone through this a little bit already. I think you've got a flavour of what this is all about. Because next here is the social system approach. But this one here, obviously it's about, we mentioned it so many times, but you can see that like in Maslow, his hierarchy of needs, he got a lot of stuff from psychology and sociology there that helped him. Or maybe he gave them a lot of stuff so that and the disciplines themselves were helped, that they didn't have it before. Human behaviour approach, kind of assumptions they make there is that we're all social. In human nature is social. It's not selfish. Okay, that it's only natural for us to group together. We're social beings. That's really one of the assumptions of human behaviour approach. And as such, we work better in teams. We work better in groups. And so therefore, if we can communicate, you have to communicate in groups. And there's a look at different ways of communicating, both direct and indirect behaviour, verbal, this sort of thing. So that was the human behaviour approach. Understanding human relations, understanding, obviously the point of communicating is to understand other people's within the workplace. Remember, the context is a business context. Understanding their workplace needs or even their social needs. It could be that having break times. It could be having a creche or a restaurant, a place to eat. It could be having other social needs for their own development, like even a gym. Google had adopted this human relations approach, where they had all of those things, and they had much more. They even had bicycles in the workplace because it was so big to get around. But that's just a minor thing. They went into it big time. Google, the human relations approach, mainly because all of their employees were highly skilled, and so they invested in them, didn't they? As you would. You can imagine people working in a distribution center where they have to maybe just put boxes into slots. That company might not feel inclined, although it might not feel inclined to make that investment that Google's made in their employees. And you can wonder why. I'll leave you to wonder why. So it's all about greater productivity, motivation, and good human relations. This is the human relations approach. We've said enough about this. The buzzwords you're going to hear time and time again is motivation, different kinds of leadership. Do you remember McGregor, X and Y? In a way, McGregor was different assumptions, but it follows on that based on those assumptions, the managers had different leadership styles. It was a continuum, but you could call it at the ends of those continuum, leadership styles, and also that follows on from this, again in a continuum, is different participative management schemes. It followed on from that. I'll give you an example of that. If you were a fan of human relations school and you liked McGregor's Theory Y, and you were a manager as well, you would probably feel intuitively that in order to get your employees to work together, not just in teams, not just providing what they need, but to give them some sort of recognise them as give them some self-esteem, to get them involved in some decision making. When people make decisions on their own or as a group together collectively, they take ownership and they follow it through, and again they're more motivated. So participation is very much a strong theme that's part of this human relations school. Obviously Maslow didn't mention it, but because he mainly focused on psychology and individuals, but it is a strong theme that constantly recurs to help people be more productive. How? Get them to make some decisions. Well, you can't do that in all organizations. A huge hierarchical organization, it's going to be very, very difficult sometimes to do that. Whereas a flat organizational structure, well, there's not much hierarchy there. Maybe it's better to with fewer divisions as well, to have a participative structure especially in a fast-moving marketplace. So there's also business reasons as well as reasons for motivating people to create better work on the existing products that they're making, and how to improve them, and so on and so forth. Marketing decisions we're talking about here can be customer relations decisions, this sort of thing, all this sort of thing. So that's the human behavior approach. Here they are: Maslow, Herzberg, we covered him. Vroom really covered ways of learning. There's McGregor. Lewin, he was somebody who wrote about change management. We don't need to go into that so much. If you can do, Argyris, very famous psychologist, wrote a lot of books about within the human relations approach. Vroom, you can look at Vroom. Let's see what Vroom did. Vroom was just outlined different ways that people learn. Vroom, human relations. So let's see. We'll cover Vroom because we covered the others already. But Vroom's kind of new. Expectancy theory. Okay, he was very much into psychology. Okay, I think it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. There's the Hawthorne studies. By the way, Elton Mayo. Did we mention Elton Mayo on the Human Relations School?
Yes.
We did. Okay. Vroom is just expectancy theory. We're not going to go into that too much because it's fraught with difficulties. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy there. There's the guy there, obviously written quite some time ago, actually. Motivated by certain expectations, theories about choice versus much effort to apply. Okay, he obviously schematized it here. Okay, he was in the human relations school, but he was his approach wasn't from the qualitative tradition really, and basically it was to increase expectations. Okay, if you did not believe increasing the amount of time you spent on study was going to give you a certain result, you probably wouldn't do it. This kind of thing. You might think it's pretty obvious, but I mean, he was an academic, wasn't he? So that's what they do, isn't it? They look at the unspoken assumptions and they write about it and they get credit for it. But there's Vroom. Let's just move on quickly though, because I know we've got a fair bit to go on here. We've covered enough people anyway, covered enough people for these contributors to human behavior approach. Scientific approach, just look at Taylor. He was the main guy with the scientific approach. That's all you need to know there. There's more, but that's the main thing. Yeah, we talked, sometimes you need to, when you go through these PowerPoints, you need to be aware that there are, it has to be in friendly terms, it has to be accessible language, and here, sometimes this human behavior approach, in particular, they do use platitudes a little bit, like Vroom used a lot of platitudes. So don't worry too much about that. If you can make sense of it, so much the better for you. Here's a social systems approach. Now, they've isolated this from the scientific management approach, the scientific approach. But I would put this actually underneath that one. But here they've isolated it out and said, oh, there's a third one here, number 3, third one. But I would put that into scientific management approach. But no matter, we can just go along with their way of looking at things here. The social systems approach is very much where they see workplace relations as occupying a social system, and when they identify factors, they really like to have factors, and when one factor changes, the other factor, there's a knock-on effect with all the other factors. It's called functionalism. The function of this is that, and they just identify factors. One of the factors can be technology. One of the factors can be management style. It's random, and they just say, well, one affects the other. Well, that's what the social system is. You can't look at them in isolation. Okay, you look at it holistically. You might have come across that word in your subject area. It includes cultural relations. It includes quite a lot of things. Okay, but and they say that the reason why it's holistic and everything affects everything else is that the purpose of it is to make sure that there's the functioning of it all is in harmony. The functioning is without conflict, and that's the reason why one thing affects another thing. So to make sure that there's equilibrium within the system, there's harmony within the system. As I say, there's a lot of platitudes here, but it's just a way of looking at things, a social systems approach. You can go into that a bit later on. There's a lot more to it, but the purpose of it is to look at the aspects of business organisation. Look at things, everything to do with that business organisation, both internal, the people, the technology, the managers, the workers, and external. It can be things like the marketplace, competition as well. And they say it's all connected, okay, which is fair enough because it is, isn't it? We know that. But they said, oh, it's all affected, and if one thing gets the others will somehow compensate it to maintain a working relationship, to maintain harmony. Pareto, yeah, it's called functionalism, by the way. And there's mechanical and there's biological as well. You might know this approach because there is biological or organic functionalism where you get that with biology, a systems approach. But anyway, this was social systems, don't forget. But they say what they're talking about here is it's well, they say there's two different approaches, organic and mechanical, but we won't go into that too much. Decision theory approach. This really often isolates the decision maker as being the manager and the manager only. Why? Because obviously they would perhaps be the owner, maybe or maybe not, but they'd be endowed with certain capabilities which nobody else has to be a decision maker. It's very elitist, but it could be true for some people. For many different kinds of reasons. So here, decision theory approach, given that's the case, then how do we optimize their decision making to increase efficiency? How do we make sure the quality of the decision is the best, optimal really is the word I'm looking for. Typically, though, it's all about control and theory X. You've got management as decision making. There's no participation from employees here. You can see it overlaps with the scientific management approach. And this kind of approach, it's almost like a systems approach or a computer model approach, because it's a formalized process. Okay, given these people have got better capabilities than anybody else, maybe not. You can just debate that for years to come. But what it is that why is that? Because they use a formal approach. Typically, it's not a listening approach really. It's a formal approach, and that actual approach has been copied from computing. And MIS, Management Information Systems, or the other way around, Management Information Systems from their surveys, when they design the systems, they often look to the decision makers, the managers, that's what they call the user requirements in some respects. So it's very much overlaps with the computer model approach, decision theory approach. It's an approach. Let's call it that. People who follow it. There's not much support for this approach, by the way. Does not take total. It ignores conflict, for example. That's an obvious one, which you always find that in organisations. Does not take the total view of management. That is to say that there's other managers there who might be equally as good, and they might not have the same decisions. That's conflict, really. So it's a weakness. There's a good criticism of that. Mathematical approach, again, I would put all these things into the scientific management approach. I would put them under that umbrella, but they've added this as a separate one. But you can use your own judgment on that. Logical entity management, here, formal approach. It's more than just decision making here. This is actually putting the formal logic in symbols, maybe writing it down, looking at relationships, causal relationships, sufficient necessary cause, if you've covered that at all in philosophy. That's a very much a mathematical approach. Computer programming approach even. How to an algorithmic approach, how to do iterative programming, all sorts of different ways of programming. As long as it can be put in mathematical symbols, then it's fine. And management do that. They sometimes do use mathematical symbols, especially when it comes to looking at like data, just raw data, or already data received from other IT sources. Can be databases, data banks, can be using SQL, can be SQL, can be spreadsheets, Visual Basic, anything like this that they can then employ the output from that, quantify it, obviously, give it some meaning, and put it into cause and effect relationships. Maybe they could use symbols as well. Simulation analysis, that's very, very popular. It used to be popular a while ago. Obviously, we know what simulation is that they simulate real world events, and even those events are symbolized, it's very sophisticated, this approach can be, only because it goes into computers and it gets processed by computers, for speed really, more than anything else. Okay, Newman, I haven't, Akov, Russell, yeah, you can go into that if you want to. It's obviously under the umbrella of scientific management. Okay, so we've talked about these two approaches, and you mustn't think that that there's only that one approach actually won the day. They are simultaneous now. Both approaches are being followed as we speak today in management and in organisations. And even though they've been criticised, you might, and I share the view that human relations approach is the best approach, but others will say no. The scientific management approach is still the best one, because now we've got quantified data, and we don't require specialists in our organisation. It's a lot of manual processing, so they adopt the scientific management approach, and they even will share maybe in the canteen when they talk to each other. You'll work out their values, management that is I'm talking about, and you'll find out that they have a theory X values of what they think about people that work there. So both approaches, the scientific, and this is under the umbrella of the scientific approach, and the human relations approach, that they both coexist. And you could say it's a bad thing. Okay. You could say it all comes down to various. It's suitable in one industry, but it's not suitable in another. This kind of argument. And that justifies the coexistence of the two approaches, isn't it? So this mathematical approach, I put that under the umbrella of the scientific school. Are you following okay? Am I talking too fast?
Perfect.
That's okay. Tell me to slow down. Raise questions if you want to. Tell me to, if there's anything that you want to ask, then it really is okay to interrupt. I would be delighted. This, as I say, 2.1 is about theory. We've covered the roots of those two theories, but now they're cascading down. I would say under the umbrella of the two main theories. Socio-technical systems is an interesting one. It's been around for a long time. What it says is that it's an approach to used in the management of people, it says, well, yeah, when you've got to improve your computing, your technical systems, and develop them and maintain them. But at the same time, because it's people that operate computers, they don't really operate themselves. You've also got to develop the people, the socio-technical people, the social side of things, and you've got to make sure the people work on the systems, the computer systems, effectively. It's one thing having efficiently run computers, but if you haven't got people who are skilled in operating them, then it's no good at all. So you have to do both things at the same time. You have to both develop people, social side of things, and you develop the technical or the scientific side of things together. One school of thought quite some time ago, actually, was the Human-Computer Interaction, HCA. Well, that was popular in universities at one time, but it was a socio-technical systems approach. It didn't favour one over the other. They said you have to do the two things simultaneously. So the technical approach is broader than just computers. It really is broader. Just as you've got rules in computing and laws of logic. Here they say, well, the organisation has policies and social laws as well as psychological factors. And obviously, this thing here, the technical aspects. So we're talking broadly, more broader than before. Technical aspects of the organisation modified by social aspects. Again, it's a platitude, isn't it? It's basically, we're just saying that the people have to operate on the technical aspects. It could be computers, or it could be modifying the rules of the organisation so that they're not to keep up to date with compliance, this sort of thing. So it just says that you have to focus on both people and technical aspects. What are technical aspects? Not just computers. Okay, can be the rules of the organisation, can be the policies, can be the written. Often it's the written rules, although we know that there's unwritten as well. So it's how people interact with the technology. Okay, that creates effectiveness, that creates improved performance. You can't just look at the one and ignore the other. Okay. Change interactions. So that does at workplace. Often that assumption is that once you've got some sort of harmony there with how people interact with the technology, then there's performance increases and there's productivity, isn't there? But often there can be interactions which are negative and involving conflict, especially when computer technology, for example, replaces human labour. I would say that was a criticism of this approach, because it assumes that once if you do adopt this approach, you're going to get more effectiveness and you're going to get harmony in the workplace. But it's not always the case. Lack of total managerial view. Okay, can just be middle management. It doesn't really outline a business view. Doesn't mention business strategy. Doesn't mention the marketplace. Doesn't mention competition. It's a very broad, almost an academic approach to managing people in organisations. Okay, it's looking at heavy emphasis on technology. Obviously, it was written quite some time ago, and quite some time ago, a lot of factories were around, a lot of production systems around. So that's why people tended to use this approach when they were looking at the best way to manage people. It's been around for a long time. But at least it emphasised that you can't ignore one for the sake of the other. You can't ignore technology when you're looking at the human relations approach, and you can't ignore the human relations approach when you're looking at technology. It works both ways. It's a two-way street. That's why they call it socio-technical systems. Okay. Again here, that's the same as before, isn't it? That's 2.1, isn't it? Are we moving on too quick? This is 2.2. Okay, 2.3. That's a bit strange. So here, we're looking at theories. This one here is one of the learning objectives, explain the importance of motivation and morale for individual performance. So we've looked at various theories. This is a kind of a continuity here. There's a bit of a break in continuity here, okay? But let's just take it in a stride. When they're talking about morale, they really mean motivation, okay? Morale is often a collective thing. Motivation is perhaps an individual thing. But it says motivation and morale for individual performance. It should be performances or individuals' performance, that should be. Well, here we have the new buzzwords, really. Morale, total satisfaction from the job. Obviously, it's groups here. Feeling of sorry, carry on.
It's okay.
Basically, what we're looking at here is actually some of these that they're covering here, again, comes under the umbrella of the Human Relations School. Okay, this does, obviously, because it's talking about satisfaction. And it's saying that total satisfaction derived by the job can make for better work, okay, better output, I suppose. Got some definitions here. It's quite straightforward here. Morale is a mental condition, okay. They're kind of blurred whether they're talking about individuals or groups here, but to take that in a stride here. In short, morale is a fusion of employees, plural attitudes, behaviours, manifestations, all taken together. So it's pretty much collective. They explain themselves here. It includes employees' attitudes. Can you see here what we have here is we were looking at we're looking at learning organisation earlier on, especially with from the point of view of technology in the other unit. And then we were looking here in this one at satisfaction from a social psychology point of view in the Human Relations School. And here we're actually now moving to transitioning between how you once you've supplied the satisfaction, once your employees are satisfied, how do you then transition into a learning organisational culture? Well, you could do that by identifying the morale, collective morale, couldn't you? If everybody is happy, why? Because they're all on their courses, aren't they? Or they're all happy because they've got the creche, or they're all happy because they're opportunities for promotion. So it's a collective thing here, morale, and then they can transition into a value-based learning organisation. So it is all about that transition from the individual and to the group, the organisation-wide learning. Okay, but for this unit, it's interesting to know that. But don't forget, this unit is kind of separate to other units. But it's also interesting to know that. So that's really what that's about. High morale, teamwork. Can you see all these words coming up now? We're going to be going into teamwork quite a lot later on, actually. But it's all part of Human Relations School. Teamwork is very much a strong element of the Human Relations School. High morale, teamwork. I think you've probably got a very good sense of the usefulness for your workplace, if it isn't there already, and how and why it's good for your own personal performance, to keep yourself motivated, keep yourself happy, satisfied, sense of belonging. Teamwork is very much a big part of it. Obviously, the academics have gone into conflict identification, resolution. Obviously, teamwork. You need to work effectively as a team. There's a lot to this. I think there might be a unit actually on teamwork, but everything overlaps anyway in the end of the day. Here we have, this hints at health and safe work environment. That's part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, It all kind of fits together. But they've put a heading here of high morale, but it does merge with, this is all under the umbrella of Human Relations School, and there were many different contributors within that school over a long period of time as well. Communication we talked about, increasing productivity we talked about, greater motivation we talked about. There are two states of morale. High morale, okay. Actually, interesting, they've got low morale here. This don't forget morale we've identified as a collective thing and as a transitionary thing to improving organisational cultures. But from a motivation and productivity point of view, they've identified low morale as something got to be avoided. And typically, you can guess that the way to do that is just to increase the motivation levers that we already know about, like self-esteem, as well as pay, by the way. Can't ignore that. That would get rid of the low morale. Greater grievances, you have to get rid of the grievances. Hertzberg wrote about that, and obviously Maslow as well. If you write that down, look into some of Hertzberg's stuff. He said that most of the things, he identified various things that could help to improve motivation, but he also said that the absence of other things, ironically, of other things would inevitably decrease motivation. It's kind of an odd one, but for example, he said if there was poor working conditions, like poor lighting or cables on the floor where people tripped over, the absence of health and safety in the workplace led to demotivation, obviously, and they're calling this low morale. And the consequence was decreasing productivity. So there's a business case for getting rid of low morale, isn't there? And Hertzberg wrote about this before, actually, but it basically just focuses on effective teamwork and getting rid of conflicts. Obviously, high morale implies that you haven't got low morale, and all of these things are really the positives, and these are the things, the negatives that need to be got rid of. They all work together here. Here we talked about motivation. That this learning objective 2 is heavy on motivation. I suppose you guessed that, and that would be the kind of motivation that motivates people to work and improve their performance and work effectively, this kind of thing, and produce better quality products, really. And also taking ownership of the work. There's a very, very strong argument for looking at motivation in that way, rather than motivating people by simply money and simply like piecework, where you produce one more thing and then you got 2 pence more for doing it. That's not the kind of motivation that they're talking about here. They're talking about motivation in a social motivation, really. Motivation looking at hierarchy of the needs of Maslow. That's what they're talking about. The kind of thing Google would be looking at and did look at. And that's why you can argue they've been very successful. It's more than just working hard, okay? It's very much it's intangible in the workplace. You can't quantify it. It's like quantifying happiness, quantifying motivation. You can measure it, I suppose, in a way, measure the outputs. That's typical, isn't it? But motivation can be associated with self-esteem, another intangible. But you can measure it by job titles, couldn't you? Assuming you get more self-esteem from a high status job title, that kind of thing. You can measure it that way. Maybe there's other ways. But enjoyment, this is really explaining the importance of motivation and how to measure it and how it relates to individual performance. So it's not just working hard, actually. It's other things as well that we mentioned just now, really. But you can't you can't give people like a canteen and a creche and a job title without giving them more money. That wouldn't work at all. You have to be accepted. They have to have decent money as well. So basically, it's a sense of satisfaction gained from completing something or achieving a successful outcome. Workplace cells in Japan, we talked about that early on. In Toyota was a good example of taking ownership of the product. And there are others as well, which you could research that's been successful in the past. Basically, you get a lot of advertising companies who focus on motivation very, very strongly. And holistically, they look at the human relations score. They look at it very seriously because they know that they need to be creative in that industry. The only way to be creative is to make sure that the employees enjoy their work. And obviously, you give them decent money, but you make sure that that they're motivated properly motivated, and you're making sure that they have satisfaction for their social needs as well. And then, creation just comes about, and that's how they get the good adverts, and that's how they get the advertising campaigns off the ground. Can be artwork, can be anything like that that's creative. They will definitely take motivation very, very, very seriously, social motivation, and they will have learned from the human relations school and apply it in business context and be successful. Explain the importance of motivation and morale for individual performance. We are going around in circles here. Need, satisfaction of needs, a lot of repetition here. There can be very broad needs, like Maslow. Like love and affection. Okay, that's very, very broad, especially in the workplace, not really realistic. Although you do get a lot of things happening in the workplace, that might well happen, but I don't think they've quantified that yet. Job satisfaction, not entirely about money, although you have to have it there. They have to have a sense of ownership, for example. It might not say that here. But they will have to be given the opportunity and the freedom, really. The freedom is quite a good word here, to participate a lot in decision making or to be creative in their contributions to whatever it is they're producing, if it requires that, this kind of thing. Now, it's always about productivity. Why? Because it's a business qualification. It's a business context. Okay, so productivity, it must be there. The question is, what's the best way of doing it? And that's why we've been talking about this. And explaining the importance of motivation, morale, and individual performance. Once we address these two things, then you get productivity. Okay, that's absolutely key. The individual's contribution to output is the result of, two variables: capacity to work and his willingness to work. This is borrowed, isn't it, from the systems approach. They're using symbols to say something, and it's we can put it better ourselves, and we have done many times. But you have to be sure that the capacity for work here is that they are they've got some sort of skill set, the capacity for work, that they're not resisting work, that they're there because they want to be, and they're willing to work as well. So these are just really saying some things which were implicit in when we use the word productivity in the workplace. Okay. And so they're just making it explicit, aren't they? This is pretty much using a very formal way of explaining productivity. It is logical to conclude, it sounds like something from a Star Trek novel by Spock, it is logical to conclude that proper motivation increases productivity. Well, I would say it's more than logical. I would say in the real world it's very effective. It's not just it's very effective in human behaviour. Proper motivation increases productivity and quality. If you want a quality product and quality. Learning process. Remember that transition we talked about. If we want to achieve a learning culture, a learning organisation, we have to address the learning process. We have to give opportunities to learn. We have to give individuals those opportunities to make them motivated. Motivation helps the learning process. It's a two-way street. And then in a collective sense, it can morph, it can transition to a learning organisation. Constant learning and constantly adapting to change in the workplace quickly because of this learning organisation is taking place. So motivation and learning, establishing there's a link between the two. I think that's probably true. If you've ever seen children in schools, they can be learning, but they might not be strongly motivated. So it's just as well to establish that it works best if they're motivated. Employees, that's definitely the case. They don't want to learn, they will not learn, even though they've been provided with the opportunity. So they have to be wanting to learn. They have to be the right caliber to value learning and have the ability as well, isn't it, to learn. capacity to respond in a way. So all these things are implicit. It's making it clearer what is meant by learning, what is meant by motivation. There's other units on human resource management, which will go into this more, and this really overlaps on that. Trainer needs to select trained on the basis of motivation, and there's other quantifiable characteristics that they'll be doing in order to select trainees. Okay, again, some platitudes here. Encourage the growth of motivation. Okay. Okay, discipline, you can write about this if you want to. It's something that really it's self-discipline. I would include this as in a sentence. If you can include this in a part of this in one sentence, then so much the better. It's really padding, isn't it? It's explaining how useful discipline is. Self-discipline, I think that's what they really mean here, isn't it? And also commitment, taking ownership. It's the same thing, but different words to explain the same thing. Dynamism. Yeah, nearly the end actually here. It's actually not too bad. We've got 10 minutes. Dynamism, you can associate. Again, it's the same thing, but using different words. You have to take that for granted here because it's an academic study. We know about learning organisations. Yeah, you can call that. We learn about transitioning from individual learning and the value set that they get from that to an organisational culture where there's organisational learning. You can call that transitioning some kind of dynamism, can't you? Dynamism and motivation, even. You can call that transition the same thing. It's the same, different words, but the same thing. Properly motivated, the kinetic energy. You can use that word if you want to. But I would say it was some sort of transitioning. But then what levers that transitioning? Well, they're saying kinetic energy, something like that. Again, they're hinting at some sort of functional approach. Do you remember earlier on the kind of the language they're using there is the language of theories that we covered earlier on. Not social technical, not that one. It's not the mathematical approach, not that one. The social systems approach. When they're saying that some kind of dynamism, this social system approach, that was the holistic approach, the identifying factors that are relevant to an organisation. Like you said, technology can be managerial styles, and they all fit together in harmony. All these it can be many different factors, and if you change one, the other ones will adjust for it and maintain this equilibrium. You can call that a dynamism, can't you? So they borrowed words from the social systems approach here. We're coming to the end. And that's what they mean by dynamism. You can explain it that way if you wish to. So here, this is about managing people. Obviously, we're going to explain the human relations school, where it came from, and the tradition, really. Is a huge, long tradition over quite a long period of time that has now led to best practice, really, for businesses. You can say depending on the business, but I would argue that all businesses require this best practice of the traditions of the human relations school. And there's no excuse, even if the business is just old-fashioned production line, you've still got to use this human relations approach to those employees. Increased participation in decision-making, this sort of thing, because that's where it all started from. It did actually all start from a factory in America where there were women workers, and it was a criticism of scientific management because this is something we can go into a bit later on. So this one was actually, I can explain that a bit later on. So low morale, we've gone into that, so already we're near to the end. I'll explain that to you. Actually, I'll give you some homework. I can give you some homework, which is quite good. Let me just give you something to read up on, so that it really makes it a bit more interesting. We don't want the room. Gregor's not so much here. It was Hertzberg I believe, and it was not McGregor. Needs from Human Relations School. The person who started it off. Hawthorne experiments. There it is. Gotcha. This was the Hawthorne experiments. What happened was this was an experiment in a factory about 100 years ago, and it was full of women workers, and the work was dreadful. But what happened was there was these researchers who went into the factory, and they wanted to. The management said, "Look, how can you make these work more efficiently?" So they got all their pens and paper out, and they were just, like empirically just observing. And all of a sudden, the women workers speeded up their work. And the conclusion of it all was that the women thought that they were being given special treatment, and they were considered valuable and valued workers. And so that's how the Human Relations School took off, because it wasn't so much being someone cracking the whip on them. They produced work because no one did that. No one punished them. They improved the quality of the work, and they even worked quicker simply because they thought they were being valued as human beings. Can you believe it? That's the Hawthorne experiment's conclusion, and that took place quite some time ago. If you go onto YouTube, you can see the actual place where that happened, if you wish to. And it really is a lesson to be learnt by all people, all managers, especially managers of people. Is that okay with you? Can I stop there? Would that be okay?
Yes, I sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's like, any questions? Do you have any questions at all? We could devote the last few minutes. I mean, if there are any questions, now's the time for it. Otherwise, I'll just log off. Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay, it's a great pleasure.
Thank you so
bye.
much.
Bye.
Thank you.